My name is Celine O'Neill and thank you for joining me for this webinar on rules of origin. So I just want to say that this session is focused on providing an overview or a high-level understanding of rules of origin. The aim isn't to make anyone here an expert. We'd absolutely need a lot longer than one webinar for that. But what I do hope to leave you with today is a better understanding of the general concepts relating to rules of origins and a set of questions that will help you in your preparations over the next few months. So when we talk about rules of origin, what are we actually talking about? In simple terms, the origin of a product means the nationality of the product. So just because I purchase a product, say, from a supplier in the UK, that doesn't mean that that product has a UK origin. The product could have originally been imported from China or elsewhere outside the EU. So the origin of the product is unlikely to have changed. So these are conversations you'll need to have with your suppliers, as they're the only person who'll be able to provide you with that information. Now you may be wondering why this is important. So the origin of the product is one of the factors that determines what rate of customs duty is paid, and it will be really important if a zero tariff agreement is reached between the EU and the UK. And only products that meet the specific requirements of the free trade agreement can qualify for preferential duty rates, which is how an FTA for zero duty between the EU and the UK would be considered. So as I said, I'm not going to try and get into all of the details of rules of origin today, but I do want to cover some of the main principles. So these main principles are common amongst the different free trade agreements, but each free trade agreement will have specific requirements included. And these product-specific rules vary according to the product, to the country, and to the free trade agreement. So you cannot assume that the rule for a certain product is the same for all of the partner countries with whom the EU has a free trade agreement. You will need to check the specific rule for each country that you are trading with. And it's important from a rules of origin perspective to understand that there's separate and different aspects depending on whether you're the importer or the exporter. So the preferential duty rate can only be claimed by the importer, but it's the exporter who needs to provide the information necessary to prove the origin. And that's generally done using the registered exporter's electronic system. And the only exemption then from the requirement to prove origin is for non-trade movements. And for non-trade movements, what we're talking about there is, say, a passenger arriving with goods in their personal luggage. So I mentioned earlier that there's some common provisions to all the free trade agreements, and they're listed on the slide. And we're going to take a little look at each of them. So when we talk about rules of origin, we're talking about whether the product or material has originating status. And what we're trying to determine is whether the goods have been wholly obtained or have been sufficiently worked in order to qualify for preferential treatment. Now, wholly obtained mainly applies to natural products and goods made from them. So perhaps an easier way of thinking of this would be to think about, say, a cow that's born and reared in Ireland. That cow will always have Irish and therefore EU origin. And any products that are made either from the meat of the cow or the cow itself will also have Irish or EU origin. If a product or material is not wholly obtained, then it must be sufficiently worked or processed in one of the FTA partner countries in order to obtain origin. And I'll give some example of sufficient and insufficient working later on during the presentation. There's also different types of accumulation depending on the type of agreement and the number of parties involved. And again, we'll look at each of those in more detail later. And the last one there on the slide relates to the concept of territoriality. So this relates to where the processing or working can take place on the product. And normally this must be done in the territory of one of the FTA partners. Now there may be some exceptions where the value added is less than 10%, but again, you will need to check the specific rules for the FTA that you're trading under. Some other common provisions include direct transport, which means that the goods must either travel directly between the partner countries, or if they're moving through the territory of a non-partner country, then the goods must travel under the customs transit procedure. And yesterday's session on land bridge and transit might be useful if you need more information in that regard. Under the general tolerance rule, the final product may still qualify for preferential treatment, even if small amounts of non-originating materials have been used. But there are two key things to note here. By small amount, we usually mean where less than 10%, and you cannot apply the general tolerance rule if you also wish to apply the derogation from the principle of territoriality. So before we get into some of the more detailed explanations of the principles, I just want to remind you that the Slido is still open, so if you have any questions that you want to submit, just log into slido.com using the event code OR184. So here are some more examples of wholly obtained products. I already mentioned a live animal born and raised in the territory or a product derived from that, but other examples would be mineral products, other non-living natural resources, vegetables, plant and plant products. So basically, things that come from the ground is maybe the easiest way to consider it. So I promised earlier that I would give some examples of what we consider when determining if a non-originating material has been sufficiently worked. So the main methods we consider are the value-added method. So this is where the value of the non-originating material does not exceed a certain percentage of the ex-works price. And the ex-works price is the combined cost of the material, labour, overheads and profit. And the percentage that's allowed will be set out in the product-specific rule of the FTA concerned. The specific process method will be set out in the product-specific rules. And remember that there will be different rules even for the same product depending on the specific FTA. And I will give some examples of this on the next slide. And a change of tariff heading is probably the most common method used. And this means that the processing must be sufficient to change the commodity code of the product from one heading to another. So for example, a raw hide that has been manufactured into shoes will change commodity heading. Now again, that's not a specific example. You would need to consult the specific rules. It's just to try and make the concept a bit easier. And there was a separate session on classification which might be of interest to you in looking at commodity codes. And finally, you can use a combination of the value-added, specific process and change of tariff heading methods together. So here's some examples of origin obtained by a specific process. So if you look at the EU-Canada Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, there's a specific rule in relation to the spinning of natural fibres or extrusion of man-made fibres accompanied by spinning. So what does that all mean? Well, an EU manufacturer might use non-originating natural fibres, spin those fibres into cotton sewing thread, and then the thread can be exported to Canada under the CETA rules and qualify as EU originating. The second example is on the Pan-Euro-Mediterranean Convention, and this rule is in relation to the manufacture from yarn. So again, you could import some yarn from outside the EU, weave it into a fabric and then make a skirt out of that fabric. And under that PEM convention, the skirt could qualify as EU originating. So some examples then, the opposite, what is insufficient processing? Well, you'll have seen from the previous examples that the processing that must be done is quite complex and significant. And some examples of insufficient or minimal operations include the preserving operations, so to ensure that a product remains in good condition while it's being transported, breaking up or assembly of packaging, simple mixing of products, and slaughter of animals. So they're examples of what's insufficient processing and would be unlikely to help you gain origin for non-originating materials. So I just want to take a moment now to move away from some of the technical definitions and to put this in context and to help you understand why it's important to consider these things as part of your Brexit preparations. So from the 1st of January, the UK goods will be considered as non-originating materials for the purposes of the EU's free trade agreements with other countries. So if you use UK originating materials in a manufacturing process and then export those goods outside of the EU, there are a number of implications. So if you export to a third country where there's no free trade agreement, then there's unlikely to be an impact, as the importer that you're selling the goods to will not be claiming preferential treatment. But if you export to a third country where there is a free trade agreement in place, then you need to look carefully at the product-specific rules of that particular agreement to see what the requirements are and to see if your product will continue to comply with the rules of origin in order to gain preferential treatment. And again, you'll need to bear in mind all of the concepts that we spoke about already: tolerance, territoriality, sufficiently worked, etc. Now, the negotiations in relation to whether there'll be duty and tariffs between the EU and the UK are ongoing. So unfortunately, we don't know what specific rules might apply for trade with the UK. But the important point to note is that if a zero tariff agreement is reached, then the concepts that we're talking about here today will apply, as origin always needs to be proven. I'm going to quickly just go through a couple of a term I mentioned earlier, by accumulation, and I mentioned that each free trade agreement includes the concept of accumulation, but the specific type that applies will differ per FTA. So the accumulation allows materials originating in one partner country to be considered as originating in the other partner country, obviously subject to specific requirements. And bilateral accumulation is the standard form of accumulation where there's only two partners to the free trade agreement. And it's on this basis that the negotiations are ongoing between the EU and the UK. The second type is diagonal or regional accumulation, and in general it operates between more than two countries, provided they have free trade agreements containing identical origin rules and that they include a provision to allow for diagonal or regional accumulation. And then finally, full accumulation applies to the working and the processing of the non-originating materials, and the working or the processing in the product-specific rules can be carried out in any of the territories of the parties to the FTA, and successive processing can count towards the final origin. Now, I've mentioned a few times that origin always needs to be proven in order to claim any preferential treatment, and there's a few ways of doing this, and they're listed on the screen. But really the one that's most frequently used is the electronic system known as the registered exporters system. And this is what's being discussed as part of the EU-UK free trade negotiations. So remembering that if you're importing the products and you want to claim your preferential rate, then your supplier in the partner country will need to provide the necessary proofs. Whereas if you're exporting or selling to a person in a partner country and they want to claim the preferential rate, you need to provide the proof for them. In addition, you need to keep documentary evidence for at least 3 years to prove the origin, and the customs authorities may request such proofs at any time under the terms of that free trade agreement. Now, in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about the impact of the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland from an origin perspective. But before I do, it's important to highlight the difference between EU origin and EU status. So if you were watching any of the webinars relating to imports, or even the protocol or land bridge yesterday, you may have heard a reference already to EU status. So basically all goods in free circulation in the EU have EU status regardless of their origin. And this means that the products can move freely within the EU once all the customs formalities have been completed on the original import. So what that means is if I purchase something from the US and then I complete all my customs formalities here in Ireland, I can sell that on to any of the other member states without needing to complete any further customs formalities. But if I haven't done the things we've spoken about, the origin will remain US. And then the origin of the product depends on all the factors we discussed. So you need to consider that, and it's that origin that counts when claiming the preference, not the status. So what is the impact of the protocol from an origin perspective? So in simple terms, the protocol allows Northern Ireland goods to have union status. So this means that customs controls aren't required for trade between Northern Ireland and Ireland or any of the other member states. However, because Northern Ireland will remain part of the UK's customs territory, Northern Ireland products will have UK origin. So you need to be mindful of this if you use Northern Ireland materials or component parts in a manufacturing process. Now, where you only sell your final product within the EU, there is no real impact for you on your trade. We don't really know yet what the impact will be if you sell your final product to the UK, as the negotiations in relation to the future trading relationship are ongoing. And where you sell your product to another third country that the EU does have a free trade agreement with, there could be implications. So just to look at that in a little bit more detail and to recap, Northern Ireland origin goods are not EU origin. They do have union status, so they're in free circulation and don't need any customs formalities when moving within the union. So no customs formalities, no declarations, no duties. And there's no need, if your supply chain involves processing in Northern Ireland, you don't need any manufacturing or processing authorisations. The existing agreements, FTAs, that are in place between the EU and third countries only apply between trade between the EU and that partner country. So Northern Ireland origin components will be treated as non-originating components under those FTAs. And the processing aspect, while I said you don't need an authorisation to do it, that processing, as we discussed earlier on, will also be considered as non-originating under those FTAs. So to try and bring all those concepts together, I've put a couple of examples in place over the next few slides. So in this example, what we're looking at is milk that's produced in Northern Ireland, manufactured into cheese in Ireland, and then sold on within the EU. So in this instance, there's no customs declarations required for the sale of the milk. There's no authorisation required for inward processing or any of those things for the manufacture of the cheese into Ireland. And because the protocol provides that the milk and the cheese have union status, they can be sold freely to the other member states. There's no customs formalities at all in that scenario. If we look at the same scenario where the milk again is purchased from a supplier in Northern Ireland, manufactured into cheese in Ireland, and then sold to a non-EU member state, and in this example we've used China, where there's no free trade agreement between the EU and China. So again, there's no customs formalities required for the purchase of the milk or the manufacturing, and the cheese can be imported into China as normal, and because there's no preferential rate to be applied here, then there will be no impact from an origin perspective. But what is important to note is that irrespective of the origin requirements for preferential treatment purposes, we are aware that a lot of companies, as part of their contractual requirements, do require that the products that they purchase from you have EU origin. So you need to be thinking about it in terms of your contractual obligations as well as from the origin preference perspective. And in this final example, it's the same scenario. You've milk produced in Northern Ireland, manufactured into cheese in Ireland, but in this instance, we're going to sell it to a country that we do have a free trade agreement with. So we've used the example of Canada. So again, there's no customs declarations or duties payable on the purchase of the milk from Northern Ireland. It's already in free circulation. No process and authorisation required. You would be, under your normal requirements for exporting to a free trade partner, you'd be keeping detailed records in order to prove origin. But if you look at the specific rules in relation to the Canada agreement, then that milk element of the cheese is deemed to be non-EU origin. And under CETA, that would mean that the cheese would not qualify as having EU origin. So I know there's nothing simple about origin, but they were actually the simple, straightforward examples. In this example, we're going to look at a more complex supply chain because we understand that this is a bit more realistic of what happens on the island at the moment. So in this scenario, what you have is milk produced in Northern Ireland, manufactured into cheese in Ireland, sent back to Northern Ireland for slicing and packaging, and returned to Ireland for storage and distribution. So all of those elements are considered to be intra-community movements as they happen at the moment. There's no customs formalities, no declarations, no duties, no authorisations required. And if you're selling that product to another EU member state, then nothing changes from how you're doing things at the moment. As with the previous example, the simple example, if you go through the exact same thing but you're selling to an FTA or to a non-FTA country, so again we've used China, again you shouldn't be impacted because there's no preferential rates to be claimed. But as I mentioned earlier, beware of your contractual obligations. There may be other requirements to provide EU origin products, and in that instance, it's unlikely that the final cheese would qualify as having EU origin. So if we look at that same example now, and we're going to go back to Canada, who we have the agreement with, and see what happens in that instance. So the milk is produced in Northern Ireland and manufactured into cheese in Ireland, sent back to Northern Ireland for slicing and packaging, and then returned to Ireland for distribution. So again, there's no customs formalities on the first sale into Ireland, or no authorisations required for the processing in the north. However, you would be required to keep all your records to prove the origin, and the milk element of the cheese, and in this instance, the slicing and packaging in Northern Ireland are all deemed to be non-EU in the context of that free trade agreement. So the preference would not apply in this instance because the milk and the processing in Northern Ireland would not be allowed under CETA. So there's one last principle that I want to explain before I wrap up, and that's the principle of accounting segregation. Now, under accounting segregation, it allows fungible materials, and by fungible we mean identical and interchangeable materials. So you can store fungible originating and non-originating materials together without the originating material losing its origin. Now, not all FTAs include this provision, so you would need to check. And where it is included, you may need to be authorised to use it by revenue. You must also be able to demonstrate that storing the originating and non-originating materials separately would be costly or difficult. Just an example of what we mean by a fungible material, if you maybe look at milk, which we know there's integrated supply chains across the island. If you've mixed Northern Ireland milk with Irish milk, it would be impossible to separate them out and tell them apart. So that's what we mean by fungible. They really must be, if once they've been mixed, you really must not be able to tell them apart again. Now, as a result, you can see that the use of the originating and non-originating materials, they can almost be used interchangeably, but you must maintain detailed records in relation to your stock management system to show, first of all, that you've not produced any more originating materials than you would have produced if you had only used the originating material. So you cannot make twice the amount by using twice the milk and then still try and claim the preference. You can only produce the amount that you would have produced had you only used the Irish element of the milk. And you must be able to prove that you had sufficient stock of originating milk in this example at the time that the origin is determined. You can determine the origin at any of these three times, either the time of manufacture, the time the origin document is issued, or the time of delivery. And just to note that accounting segregation doesn't generally apply to products. So I've one example here to go back to our CETA agreement to show a similar example here where we're using our milk from Northern Ireland, manufacturing or mixing with Irish milk here in the Republic, slicing and packaging it, and then sending it off to Canada. So again, no customs declarations or duties are required for the purchase of the milk and bringing it down into Ireland. It's in free circulation. There's no processing authorisation required here for the work that's going to be done in Ireland. Now, you must have your stock management system in order to prove the things we spoke about, that you've the sufficient quantities of the Irish milk on hand. The Northern Ireland milk element of the cheese would still be deemed to be non-EU origin in the context of the FTA, and therefore it wouldn't meet the requirements of the product-specific rule. And in theory, that would mean then that it wouldn't qualify for the preference. But if you are using accounting segregation, and you can prove the things we just spoke about, because the Northern Ireland milk is fungible, then using the mixed milk would allow that cheese to qualify. And again, you do need to prove all of these things. So if you are considering using this method, you would need to keep quite detailed records. I suppose one thing that I didn't mention just before I recap is just because you're trading with somebody in an FTA partner country and the option is there to claim preference, that doesn't mean you have to claim the preference. You will have got a flavour of what's required here today to prove origin, and you can see it's quite complex. It could be quite time-consuming, and it could be quite costly. So you may consider then that the benefits of proving the origin don't outweigh the reduced tariff rate that you can avail of on the import. So it's just something to bear in mind when you're doing your plans. I think I've probably bamboozled you enough with some technical information, and we might just move on to the Q&A session then, and we'll be able to delve into some of the issues in a bit more detail. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much for that, Celine. And good afternoon, everybody, and you're very welcome to the panel discussion in relation to rules of origin. I'd like to welcome back Jerry Corcoran and Patricia Redden, if any of you were on the classification and tariff evaluation module earlier on. You will have seen both of our colleagues, and Celine is staying with us socially distanced at the lectern, so thanks very much for that. I think whether anybody is new to origin or even has dabbled with it, the level of complexity around it will really just it won't be lost on anybody. It really is. It's a difficult area, particularly if you're new to this space. If you haven't dealt with third country before, it's definitely going to be something that's you really need to get in and understand what's going on and see, is it worth the benefits of the preferential that you've described, Celine. And I think the other element that struck me in terms of your presentation is the level of proofs that you're going to need to actually prove that really is going to be it's going to be significant. So I think there's maybe a word of caution, but look, there could be benefits. But I don't. Would you like to comment?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the requirement to proof is always there. We covered that, and we've covered how you can do it. But really, I suppose it could be, for some companies, it could be a significant change on how they currently do business. But then for other companies who already have sophisticated software in place for managing their stocks and all of that, it might not be as difficult. So I know the whole presentation as one piece was a bit overwhelming, but when they delve down into the specific requirements, a lot of companies might already have most of what they need in place, and they just need to consider the specific product, the specific rule, and the specific FTA just to make sure they can meet those requirements.
That's a good place to start. And that probably I might even pick up the first question. And as we've seen through most of these sessions, the questions, a lot of them are covered in the presentations, but it's still worth raising them again. It's worth raising them again and apply them to the business model of somebody who's putting the question in. And the first one is, like, how do I determine the origin of my imported goods? I know you covered that, and there's a number of options. Would you suggest a starting point for people?
And I don't know how many times we've said this now, the starting point is the conversation. I mean, we can't overstress how important communication right along the supply chain is now at this stage. But I mentioned it briefly, and in case anyone missed out on it, your supplier really is going to be the only person who's going to be able to give you the concrete information needed, either to determine the origin or to prove the origin. So again, just to go back to what I was saying, if I purchase a product from a supplier in the UK, I cannot assume that that product has a UK origin. I don't know where that originated from, so I don't know, did the supplier in the UK purchase the raw material from outside, from say China or the US or wherever, and then used it in a manufacturing process. Obviously, one thing I didn't say earlier, and just to really confuse people, the UK will have their own set of requirements in relation to rules of origin as well, and what they'll allow for manufacture of products in their territory. It should be similar to what we've spoken about today, because, you know, these are general concepts, not EU specific, but all of that needs to be borne in mind. So you really have to start the conversation with your supplier, and they should be able to provide the information necessary to determine the origin.
Great, thanks, Celine. And Jerry, I might come to you next. I mean, and again, I know Celine did reference this in the presentation, but there's a question around what kind of proofs of origin do I require for my imported goods? Yeah. So would you comment on maybe what are the critical pieces of proof that people need to be aware of?
Well, for many of the older agreements that the EU have, the proof of origin is an EUR1 certificate, which is issued by the customs authorities of the third country involved. You can also make an invoice declaration, which is a standard formula of words placed on an invoice by an exporter who is authorised to give that origin proof.
So importers need to look out for
those. And with the UK, then it'll be whatever. If there is an agreement, it'll be whatever is agreed under the agreement. And like Celine said, possibly the REX registration would be used.
Okay. Slide 15, if anyone wants to recap on what the different documentary proofs are, will be a help. But yeah, as Jerry says, what's being considered under the EU-UK negotiations is the use of the registered exporter system. So if anyone is already exporting to an EU partner country, they will have familiarity with that already.
And that's a good point, Celine, in terms of just reminding people, we've said it before, the whole sessions are being recorded. They're going to be available, both slides, all elements of this are going to be available on the Revenue website in the next couple of days. So you'll be able to go back through all of this at your leisure, maybe map out the journey that Celine has taken you through. I think at first, it's important to cover all of the principles and the theory in the early stages, but maybe the application of going through the journeys you might find very useful to connect with what it is that you need to know and what are the important parts. Celine, this one is actually related to a deal scenario, so I might put this one to you. What duties will I pay on goods imported from the UK if there is no deal?
Yeah, if there's no deal, then the EU has a common customs tariff schedule, so it's already in place and it's available under the Tariff. It is Tariff, isn't it, Patricia? TARIC. It's a website on the Europa website. You'll be able to find links to it. And they list the current tariffs that are in place for imports from outside the EU. But obviously then any special arrangement that's reached with the UK, you're back into needing to prove the origin in order to claim that preference. So tariffs range from 0 on medicinal type products right up to 50% depending on, beef is the one we're all familiar with that has a high tariff. And in that instance, it's calculated not only on the price but on the weight. So it is complex, but the tariff would be a good place to start to get an idea of the kind of rates that might apply.
So that'll give a sense of the financial impacts maybe that could be coming if there's no deal. That's probably a good place to prepare. Patricia, you wanted to come in there?
I just wanted to add that we have a link to the tariff on the classification page of our website as well.
Right,
it's on the classification page.
Yeah. Okay, if my imported goods come from France and have some work done on them in the UK, how will this influence the duty payable? Jerry, would you like to take that one?
Well, yeah,
if there's coming in from France, there's work being done on them in the UK, how will this influence the duty payable?
Yeah, it's a Brexit question again. If there is no deal, then they will lose their EU status and their EU origin when the work is done in the UK.
Okay.
So they'll be paying the top rate of duty coming from the UK. If there is a deal, then obviously whatever the rule of origin is between the EU and the UK would apply.
I might keep to this vein, then there's another question that has come in just recently there. Will products imported from the UK with EU origin keep their EU origin for the import declaration? So I'm presuming that's post.
Unfortunately not. I think it's important to note it's the time of the importation that's really key here. So anything that's imported after the 31st of December this year from the UK, even if it did have EU origin to start with, will be considered UK origin. There's a slight variation that goods that are in movement. So if I've purchased the goods, say, on the 30th of December, they're currently being transported to me and they arrive on the 1st of January. In that instance, that would be fine, but that's a very, very time-limited scenario where that will happen. But as a general rule of thumb, anything that you import after the 31st of December will be considered to have UK origin.
As you said, that window is very small for that exceptional consideration, but still I think you've covered that. Can all products benefit from preferential origin? Jerry, you might take that?
Again, it depends on the free trade agreement. Generally, they try to cover as much as possible. Some are reduced to 0, some are reduced by a certain amount only. Agricultural products are generally maintain some kind of significant duty under free trade agreements.
Okay. So where will people get information in relation to that?
Well, you really need to look at the tariff and pick your particular country, pick your tariff code, and see what duty applies for that free trade agreement.
And identifying the tariff code brings us back to the module that we had earlier in relation to the tariff classification, and people might like to rewatch that. And I know we've said it so many times across all of these, there really are so many linkages with the other modules, so definitely encourage people to check in on some of those. What is the difference between preferential and non-preferential origin? Jerry?
Preferential origin applies for a free trade agreement, so that's the simple way to think of it. A free trade agreement gives you preferential origin. Origin is needed for other reasons besides your free trade agreement. For example, for anti-dumping duty, which is a unilateral duty applied by the EU all over the world. So that's non-preferential origin. The EU have their own ways of determining origin for those purposes.
Okay. And there's more information on our website in terms of under the origin section. There's more information if people want to get in behind some of this in a little. I mean, in terms of the constraints of today, we're probably giving kind of high-level responses to some of the questions that come in. So again, there is far more detailed information on the website.
Yeah, all declarations. Origin is required for all declarations, all customs declarations. Only some of those will have free trade agreements.
Sure. Thank you. If a country is eligible for more than one preferential arrangement, can I choose which one I use? You're in the hot seat, Joe.
Yes, you can. Of course, you can choose. It depends on how you fill out your declaration. You're making your choice there. So
Okay.
you don't have to avail of like Celine said, you don't have to avail of the preferential origin.
Okay, and again, it's kind of what's the overhead or the burden, the administrative burden in proving that, or as to whether or not it is really of benefit to your business.
And to remember that it's the supplier who provides that proof. So it depends on what systems they have in place. I know I said earlier that some of the bigger businesses might already have sophisticated IT systems in place, and that will certainly help in terms of your exports. But in terms of your imports, it's your supplier who will need to give all of that information, and they may not be able to comply with it. So it's again, goes back to those conversations.
I think that we've said it several times, we really should be looking at a model from 21 that it is far more integrated, and each party in the supply chain, it doesn't just apply to origin, but each party in the supply chain really needs to know what everybody is doing and what information and data is required at each stage and from which party.
Yeah.
People really need to get much more informed about the end-to-end process, I think. If we purchase raw materials of an animal origin from GB, does processing the goods in ROI to produce a finished cooked product change the country of origin to ROI? So we've purchased raw materials from GB.
Yeah, that really will depend on the product-specific rule within the free trade agreement that you might be, again, exporting the goods under to some other third country that we might have a free trade agreement with.
Okay.
Yeah, so
And it would have to meet the product-specific rules to meet the EU origin requirement.
Conditions,
Yeah, so the specific rules aren't currently agreed between the EU and the UK for trade between the EU and GB after the end of the transition period. But what we do know is that the current EU FTAs are only with that partner country. So it depends on where it goes back to the example that I gave earlier, depending on where you're going to sell the product. If you're going to sell the product within the single market, then really it doesn't, the tariff that's paid will be on the original import of the meat from the UK. And once you pay that tariff, you can sell it anywhere in the EU with no further implications. But if you're selling it then on to, say, Canada, where we do have an agreement, you'd need to look at the specific rules in the Canada agreement that relate to the finished product that you wish to sell. Yeah. And you kind of work backwards to see what are the requirements there that you need to meet.
And generally they protect the meat in that way. They don't allow non-originating meat to be used like in the question, to make a cooked product. Generally they wouldn't allow that.
Okay. Celine, you did cover the issue around EU origin and EU status, and there's really just a question for confirmation around, do NI goods qualify as EU origin?
No, is the very short answer, but I will expand slightly. Because Northern Ireland legally remain part of the UK's customs territory, that determines their origin, so they'll have UK origin. But because the beauty of the protocol and the idea behind it to avoid any checks or controls or return to a hard border, then the product is considered to have union status, which means there's no further customs requirements when it's moved within the EU. But just to bear in mind that any current requirements, specifically say in relation to live animals, will continue to apply. So if you need an intra-community health certificate, for instance, you're still going to need that. But that's the same thing that applies for live animals moving between any of the member states.
Yeah, that's helpful. There's a number of questions around this one. What's the documentation requirement from a supplier availing of an FTA to prove origin? And do we have to verify the origin of all imports from GB?
So it goes back to the systems we were talking about. If there's an agreement between the EU and the UK, the system that will be used will be the registered exporters. So it's your exporter in the UK who will need to enter the information onto the REX system, and that you then use to prove the origin. But again, you only have to really prove, you have to, as Jerry said, you have to state the origin on every customs declaration, regardless of whether you're claiming a preferential duty rate or not. So you're always going to have to know the origin to be able to declare it on your declaration. But you only really need to prove it when you're claiming that preferential origin, or for the purposes Jerry mentioned earlier, the anti-dumping duties and that kind of thing. So it really depends on what's agreed between the EU and the UK as part of the trading negotiations. But yeah, it'll be all done through REX if there is something agreed, and you must prove it to claim a preferential rate.
Okay. We're talking quite a bit now around FTAs and where they do and don't exist, and there's a question around, is there a list of FTAs which allow accounting segregation?
And there is, yeah. There's a good guide to our preferential origin on the EU website. It's a really good guide. And
which
it's
one
totally
is that? Is it the Commission's website, or how do people access that?
Yeah, well, you could Google maybe DG Tax with Tariff and follow from there, you'll find it.
That's fine. It's the EU Commission's website.
Yes.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's great. Do products purchased from a UK distributor which were manufactured in Asia qualify for duty exemption?
Not necessarily is all I'd say, because it depends on what was done with them in the UK, whether they'll obtain UK origin or whether they'll maintain their original origin. And then that's what you're looking at. While you might be importing from GB, the origin might still be China or Korea or wherever, and that's what will determine the rate.
I'm smiling here in terms of the next, and I appreciate the answer there, but I'm just smiling at the next question that comes in. And I'll preface this with kind of saying time is against us, but somebody has asked, and I will accept you not answering this should you decide, but can you once more briefly explain the principle of territoriality in the context of origin? One, I'll ask you, is that possible?
I'll try and keep it simple.
Yeah,
territoriality relates to where, so we mentioned how you obtain status, and one of those ways is by sufficiently working or processing the material. So the concept of territoriality applies to where that work is done. And normally in a free trade agreement, it can only be in the territory of one or other of the partners to that agreement. So if we just give a real quick example, for the purposes, say, of CETA, then the processing would only be allowed to be done in either the EU or in Canada. So under the context of the protocol, where Northern Ireland goods now won't have EU origin, if that processing took place in Northern Ireland, then the value added during the processing needs to be considered from that territoriality perspective. So you do need to consider all of the implications across all of your supply chain.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank everybody on the panel, Jerry, Patricia, Celine, thank you all very much. My apologies, I know I haven't gotten through to all of the questions, and thank you very much for that level of engagement on this really complex topic. You know, it certainly, it's very pertinent kind of issue right now, but it certainly is a complex one. If you have any specific business related queries that you on this topic that you want to send in to us, we've said it before, please just send them into brexitqueries@revenue.ie, and we will pick them up, and our SMEs here will be able to tease those answers out for you. Thank you very much again for joining us for this session. Our next session is starting at 5:45, and it's on financial considerations. We'll be looking at comprehensive guarantees, deferred accounting and deferred payments and postponed accounting, my apologies. So please come back to us for that one. Thanks very much.